Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, this overheating planet, human heated planet, still wrapped in a pandemic. I'm sad to report I've got a bunch of friends in New York City who've already had their kids pulled from school because they're sick with COVID again and again. It's hard to keep track of the variants, and the variants will keep emerging as long as the world, not just the country, is inadequately vaccinated. There's still several billion people with a B who haven't had one shot, let alone a full array. I just had my second booster, being a senior citizen now, and I'm very grateful for the science and the governance that allowed that to happen. We're on a planet that's been rendered even more turbulent by Vladimir Putin, whose invasion of Ukraine is still playing out and disrupting everything from food supplies in in northern Africa. You're going to see more headlines there. I already did a show on that and more to come, to the effects on oil and energy gas markets and how that turbulence plays out on top of the inflation and the other issues. If you're a president or in Congress, you're facing, as I put it here, many rocks and hard places. And I'm really pleased today to have Congressman Sean Casten from the 6th District of Illinois join us. He's a member of the House Select Committee on the climate crisis. I have Nina Ignaczak, who is a really innovative journalist based in Michigan. She founded Planet Detroit and now is also running the Michigan Climate News newsletter / blog on the Bulletin platform that I also use. And Antonio Mora, who is a veteran TV journalist, broadcast journalist with a luminous career, including the news anchor on Good Morning America, and now has a column here also at Bulletin called A View from the Center. And he, like I do, is trying to find, it's not always the middle, but what is actually doable on, what do we get done here beyond posturing? On my issue of the day is climate, but, you could name any issue, Congressman Casten, and when it gets into the legislative arena, it ends up looking like what I have here with this. It's an 1884 cartoon that originally was Grover Cleveland navigating some horrific storms, and now, of course, it's Biden. And we have so many issues to discuss. One of the big ones is these dueling narratives. Whoops, I'll get back to that in a bit. Dueling narratives are, more and more supply side. Let's boost our gas production and oil production, get it out the door, help Europe forestall the gas crunch. And the other is efficiency and transition and transformation. As you can see here, that's a heat pump that the people who now own my former house in the Hudson Valley were able to do what I couldn't do, both because of money and limited technology 7, 8, 10 years ago. They took an old house with the oil heat and they've rendered those oil tanks in the basement museum pieces by putting in an efficient heat pump. So let's just get started. And Amy Jaffe from Tufts may join us. She's a top scholar and practitioner on energy policy. First of all, it's a Friday. How are you doing? Let's start with you, Congressman Casten. Where are you today? And, how are you doing just generally? How's life?
Oh, I'm doing well. I'm back in Illinois. We're on our district work period, as they say. Steny Hoyer always says you were not on vacation, you were on a district work period. So back in Illinois this week and next week, and then go back to DC.
And how did climate come to be a particular passion of you? You have a background as an engineer, and just tell us a little bit about what got you focused on that tough issue. By the way, I see Amy Myers Jaffe is in the green room, just grabbing a quick cup of coffee there and a donut before. I'll bring her on in a second.
Well, I mean, look, the short answer is facts and truth, right? When you're driving down the highway in the wrong lane and you see a truck coming, you should focus your effort on swerving. We can get into more complexity than that, but that's the reality. I was been concerned about climate and basically my entire professional career. Started out thinking this was a scientific problem, was working on developing cellulosic biofuels, moved into engineering, gradually was struck by how many companies, was doing technology consulting, half of our clients were companies that had huge equity valuations and needed help developing their technology. And the other half were companies that had no money and couldn't figure out why no one would buy their proven technology, and just came to appreciate that this was really a deployment problem. So spent 16 years as an entrepreneur building some companies, and just gradually came to realize that there are no thermodynamic laws that prevent us from massively lowering CO2 emissions. There are no economic laws that prevent us from doing so in a way that would grow our economy. But there are a ton of state and federal laws that get in the way. Because we have so distorted our energy system with subsidies, and that's both depressing for what we've done historically. It's also an amazing opportunity going forward. But like I said, I've been trying to swerve the truck for 20 years and so far failing.
Yeah, just briefly, as a journalist, I made that transition. My first 20 years on the climate beat, I started in 1988, half of my life ago. And I really got sucked into it being a science story. I was a science writer. It was all about CO2 and impacts on ecosystems and human systems and the technologies. And then it was like 2006. So 18 years into my journey, I interviewed my first social scientist, University of California, Irvine, Helen Ingram. And that was the first time, Al Gore's movie had come out and things were really getting inflamed. And she told me some basic facts of social and political science that I had not absorbed. And it was like, this isn't going to happen unless I really dig in on those things. So I shifted as much as I could more to like that realm. So I'm glad I'm not alone. So Nina, you're in the great state of Michigan, and you could be reporting about all kinds of things, agriculture, poverty, Detroit's challenges just as a city. What got you climate centric?
Well, I'm here in Detroit today, waiting for spring. So I don't know if that was it, but all of those issues that you mentioned, I think have a climate connection to them. And so that's sort of what we focus on in Planet Detroit and in Michigan Climate News, is, what are the climate and energy implications of Detroit's and Michigan's poverty levels and the inability of kind of the state to move forward in terms of addressing energy burdens on low-income residents, and trying to just advance. We have, in many ways, we're a backward state, but in many ways we have a lot of advantages in terms of technology and our history with the automobile industry. We've kind of been on the losing side for a lot of years, but I feel like, we have the potential within Michigan to be a leader on some of these issues if we can embrace the fact that we need to move forward. To move forward, we need to address equity issues. And so those are kind of the sort of the nexus where we report. And we're trying to just raise awareness about what is happening in the state, what's not happening in the state, what policies are being promoted at the federal level or at the state level. And also we're trying to report more closely on what our local utilities are doing, because they really drive a lot of this. Our utilities in Michigan are investor owned largely, meaning they're privately owned and investor responsive to their investors, but they also are overseen by a public body, the Michigan Public Utilities Service Commission, that basically guarantees their profits. And we just saw last week data that shows that our local Detroit utility shut off more accounts during the pandemic to low-income people who couldn't pay their bills than any other utility in the state. So those are the issues that we're trying to address here in Detroit and Michigan.
Well, as you've just articulated, climate and energy are basically every story.
Mm-hmm.
They're agriculture, poverty. The impacts of climate hazards are profoundly greater on people who are been pushed to margins of whether it's an urban margin or, as I've written a lot about, in developing countries. So that's great to see. And I love, the more we could do to facilitate sort of regional networked journalism like what you're doing, the better. I think it's fantastic. Antonio, I'll get to you in a second. I want to introduce Amy Myers Jaffe from Tufts, who runs the Climate Policy Center at the Fletcher School, is a professor there, and also is head of an initiative on women and energy at Columbia University at the Center on Global Energy Policy. It's really great that you could come on here on short notice, Amy. And how are you doing today?
I'm doing great and glad to be here in such an illustrious group.
Well, we're glad that you're here. And I wanted to show a visual here, if I can get this to work, showing some of the things you've dug really deep over the course of your career on oil demand, the global trends. And one of, course, the realities that Congressman Casting knows too well is that in the US, even if we produce more oil, that doesn't magically lower the price at the pump here because of the global dynamics, global markets, and gas has got all its own complexity as well. So it's great that you're here. And could you just maybe give a brief sketch of what your prime concerns are right now when you think about the multidimensional challenge that the president and or the Democrats who still, any congressional move right now is really going to be Democratic, at least through November. We'll see what happens after that. So what does that look like if you got into an elevator with Manchin and Biden and let's say Congressman Casting, what could you tell them?
Well, when you start your career writing about oil and then you pivot to make your focus climate change, you bring a different set of concerns and ideas to the table because you're having a sense of geopolitics that's maybe a little bit different than scholars that have been studying the governance process for climate change from Kyoto and on through the Paris Accord and to Glasgow. So I come at it a very different perspective, very aware of the challenges of the scale of the challenge that we face in pivoting to clean energy, but unbelievably aware of the opportunities. That last book you showed there on the screen is really about the opportunities. And having spent 5 years in California when Jerry Brown was governor, trying to help the state fashion its climate policies and structures and pricing in a way that would press the oil industry to pivot and invest more money in solutions for climate change and less money in fighting efforts towards climate change. So, a little bit of a warrior in that regard. But I do think at this moment in time is the most challenging moment we faced because we can really now very much see that we've passed the threshold, as the latest IPCC report put forward. We've passed the threshold on some ecosystems for adaptation. In other words, there's no going back. There are tree mortality and coral reef destruction and Arctic melting that is permanent. And but then we can still, there's a lot of catastrophe we can avoid if we act. But we're in this moment in time where we also have to consider ourselves with the geopolitics of a war.
Right.
And, all modern, mostly modern, maybe not drones, but, the rest of everything governments used in wartime is fueled by oil. And we have to concern ourselves with making sure that our oil security is not disrupted by the war, but that we can both make sure our national security is protected in the very short run while not jeopardizing the solution, which is to move away from oil, in the long run, for multiple reasons now. Now we can all see, which I've been, writing about, you showed that book, that goes back to 2010, the damage that comes when we have so much dependent on oil that we send money abroad to regimes like Vladimir Putin and others, and they amass this massive amount of oil and gas revenue. And then what do they do with that money? I mean, as I say here in my book, All Oil Dollars, Debt, and Crises, they spend that money on weapon systems. And
Yeah.
we've seen over and over and over again how they spend that money and the weapon systems either repressing their own populations or attacking a neighboring country. And I think we have to mobilize now to address that pattern and get rid of it, while at the same time addressing the immediate need for fuel, which is based on the path dependency of decisions we've made for the last several decades.
Mm-hmm.
So, to me, the sweet spot with Senator Manchin and others is to, give the oil industry what it needs this 10 seconds to make sure that we're prepared for a wider war if, God forbid, that would happen, while at the same time making sure that every step we take that's forward-looking, whether that's us or Germany or allies in Japan, Australia, that every step we take that's legislation for the next 10 years is 100% focused on preparing us to move to low-carbon energy.
It feels really compelling. There's a trajectory there and a picture that can be sold. Biden has a big challenge still getting this point across. It's to me, there's this utter tension between the now and the next. And I have friends on both ends of the spectrum, production-minded people and climate hawks, and each one wants the microphone and each one wants a dominant kind of propellant for this pathway. And this gets to Antonio, and then we're going to spend some time with Congressman Casting, because we just had a hearing, one of many last week, would have made some of these points. But let's get to Antonio. Your a view from the center is really about consensus and cooperation amid all of this. What have you learned in your decades? Whether the issue is climate or justice or various things. I'm sure as a news, as a journalist doing what you do, how do you not tear your hair out every month? You do post every month on dunces, the dunces of March, the dunces of February. But where is the opposite? Who are the non-dunces?
You're assuming I don't tear my hair out, which I often do, and I often throw shoes at the television set when I'm listening to things. I'm less climate focused in my writing than the rest of you are, but I do look at the issues, trying to look at it from a centrist perspective. But centrist, not, as Andy said earlier, not really trying to find a middle, because sometimes there isn't a middle. With between two extremes, you simply can't find. There are certain things that are objectively right, and I tend to look at that objectivity through the eyes of the American people, through what polls show the American people believe. And you'd be surprised at how a majority of Americans really agree on a lot more than they disagree. It's just that we tend to listen to the extremes a little too often. And I think that's what's happening to a great extent on climate change. And we can talk about that a little later as to what some of the polls show, and really how there's surprising agreement, or at least majorities, in favor of many climate actions. And I'm joining you from Miami, which has been called the major city in the world that is most at risk for climate change. Our neighboring city of Miami Beach, 15 minutes away from where I am now, the average elevation is 4 feet. We've already seen the sea rise over the past 3 decades. And if that continues, I've seen it in person, how Miami Beach floods now. You don't need hurricanes or tropical storms. You just need a big, heavy rainmaker in an hour or two. And, streets of Miami Beach are flooded. Even areas that never used to flood in Miami, along Brickell Avenue, the financial center, will flood these days when there's a significant storm. And, I like to joke with somewhat dark humor. I'm actually at one of the highest spots in the city of Miami. I'm in Coconut Grove, at about 19 feet of elevation, and I'm only 200 yards or so from Biscayne Bay. And I joke that these things keep going as they're going, I'm going to very soon be oceanfront property, which might be nice for me, but it wouldn't be nice for the dozens of houses that are just below me on the way to the water. So here you really see the effects of climate change on a regular basis, and it shocks me when people are not concerned about it and not willing to take action to improve matters.
Well, that's a good transition to Congressman Caston and the navigation you have to do. And your representatives are up for re-election every 2 years, so you also are beholden each year to those pressures in the politics. I'm not sure. I don't know your. Tell us a little bit about the 6th district, perhaps. I'm not. Is that a safe district, or is that a misnomer for any district? And then how do you deal with these pressures of the kind of the meme versus finding common ground?
Well, I want to first agree with Antonio that there's tremendous more alignment than you would think from just if all you do is watch people scream at each other on CNN every day. And the proof of that's my district. This district was Republican from 1972 until I flipped it in 2018. My predecessor won the seat by 18 points before I beat him by 7, won again 7 last time, and it's after redistricting is still just as purple. I campaigned primarily. I was asked early on, "What are your top 3 issues?" And I said, "Climate, climate, and climate," and I won. That wasn't because it tested well. It's because there's this crazy thing that sometimes I think those of us who follow polls get confused about, which is that you can actually lead people. I know it's a crazy idea, but if your goal is to sit around and wait to have people tell you where to go, maybe you're not cut out for this line of work. And you can shape public opinion. And sadly, what was academic 20 years ago is now becoming a reality. Was it 40% of Americans were exposed to either a wildfire, a drought, flooding, some climate-induced disaster last year? It's starting to pull well for horrible reasons, right? We know NOAA has said that by 2050, sea levels down where you are, Antonio, sea levels in Florida are going to be 18 inches higher by 2050, 2 feet higher in the Gulf Coast. That means if you buy a home in Pensacola today, it will be underwater before your mortgage is paid off. These are facts, and people get that. Right. I think that the challenge we have politically is not that there is division in the American public. It's that the structure of Congress makes those people who are elected to be Republicans and Democrats not reflective of Republican and Democratic views in the American public. We've really the by and large, the Republican Party has become the party of rural, poor America. The Democratic Party has become the party of urban, more affluent America. It didn't have to be that way. It's sort of just the way that it's shaken out. But if you think about what we would do, you're the person you sold your house to, Andy, who put those heat pumps in. They're richer now. They don't have to pay for as much gas and oil anymore as they used to.
Right.
They get more money in their pocket. That's a great thing. The private sector is doing that because it's a good thing to do. In the course of doing that, we are effectuating a massive wealth transfer from the energy producing parts of the country to the energy consuming parts of the country. Mm-hmm. We're creating vastly more wealth than we're destroying, but rising and so there's this tension where areas like West Virginia, like the Gulf Coast, where the economy depends on energy extraction, and a world that depends more on geothermal, on heat pumps, on solar, on wind, on efficiency, on electric vehicles. There's a world where we don't have to pay for a lot of that stuff anymore. And that's good for the average American, but is creating wealth transfers for some. And, one of the things that I think has been most frustrating for us, in the course of the Build Back Better, wherever we're going to call it, negotiations, is that we were very intentional about trying to make sure that these economic gains do provide for a just transition from those folks in those regions. And the people who blocked that were primarily the people who represent folks in those regions. And so if we don't get that done, you're going to find that markets are going to do this anyway, right? Yeah. People are, the oil industry right now is trading at like a 6x multiple. That's the kind of multiple you give an industry who you do not trust with your money. You're just in a cash stripping mode. Meanwhile, the Teslas of the world, the solar manufacturers, they are attracting capital, but we cannot expect them to say, what should we do about the West Virginia coal miners? They're not going to. They don't have a moral obligation to. We can't judge them for doing that. Government should do that. And yet the primary obstacle to making sure that we do that are people who represent those regions. And that creates political tension, but I think it's worth understanding that the median American voter is well to the left of Joe Manchin, even though he is the farthest right member of the Democratic caucus. And we can't let the debates in Washington confuse us about what the debates are among the American people.
And yet at the same time, and maybe we'll get some input from Antonio and Amy on this, the reality is that to get something passed this year, the Joe Manchins of the world have to come onto the boat, that rocky boat I was showing you earlier.
No, that's true. And I'm actually optimistic that we're going to find a way to get that done. I just think, like I said, there's a structural problem that the Republican Party's power in Washington comes from our minoritarian institutions. The majoritarian institutions are on board. The Senate was designed to block to make sure we didn't have a fully representative democracy. That was the great compromise. Mm-hmm. Do not confuse the ability to get something through the Senate with what the American people want us to do. Because if we were comfortable with what the American people wanted us to do, we only would have had a House of Representatives. We would have gotten rid of slavery earlier, and we never would have had a union. That was why we created the Senate, right? And it's a challenge, and we have to deal with that reality. But just we can't confuse that for public debate. Is all I'm saying.
So, Amy, perhaps again tracking this at the macro level and then at the political level. Do you see a prospect here for the Democrats to get something done? I saw a piece recently saying it really practically speaking has to be by Memorial Day or so. So I don't know how closely you keep track, but what do you think about this?
I'll tell you what I think. I think that on the very left, people have to let go of their pet projects. We don't need to fund electric bicycles in wealthy urban settings. Right? What we need to do is help average Americans afford an electric vehicle. We need to have public charging infrastructure to make that viable. We need to help implement community solar and what I call virtual power plants. So I have, solar panels in a community, could be a low-income community, and then I'm leasing a battery to everybody in that community, and I'm aggregating all those batteries to help with intermittency. So if I have a heat wave, my utility or the vendor that's reporting to my utility can pull stored electricity from each one of those little batteries to give me the boost as if I had another facility like a coal plant. I need to be moving those technologies into the system, and that takes market design. So that's going to take a reform in how we do electricity pricing. Maybe we should be, I know we have the discount in the wholesale level and higher price in the retail level, but what that does is it messes over average Americans for what they're paying at home to subsidize, Google for putting in a cryptocurrency data center in a place to, balance renewable energy. So they should be paying a higher price because they have to have electricity all the time. And you and I in our homes, if we're doing something, we should get a break. So, but that's not the way electricity is priced today in the United States. So, that's really a barrier. And thinking about, I like what the Biden administration is going in the direction. I like the direction of using the Securities and Exchange Commission to make reporting by companies 100% accurate. Don't tell me you're going to net zero, and I'll tell you in 2050 how I'm going to do it. You're going to pledge that now and get some stock benefit from your shareholders. Then I want to see what you're doing. I want accurate reporting of your emissions. I want to see if you're participating in the voluntary offsets market. I want to see verification that the so-called trees you're planting or whatever your solution is isn't going to disappear in 5 years and be valueless if you have it on your balance sheet. So we're moving in that direction. And we have this sort of litigation culture. So we would be at a much lower oil price if we had allowed the Commodity Futures Exchange Commission, CFTC, to put some limit on the front month because, every pension fund in the world is paying a hedge fund manager to put them in commodities today. And that's inflating, this month's oil on the futures market compared to, many months forward. And so therefore we're releasing the SPR, which in my opinion was the right move, right, to help average Americans, but also position us in the market that if something worse happens, at least we're not on the defensive with low inventories. But it's hard to get the price down because all this litigation from the banks and others and trading companies, we couldn't put a high enough margin call on the front month. And we weren't allowed to impose position limits, which I know is a little inside baseball, but would have worked. And who will lose if the market flips around? It'll be everybody's pension fund that's going to lose because everybody's pension fund's betting commodities.
So let's hear from the two journalists. Either if you have a question or a reaction based on the feedback you get from your readers when you deal with polarization and these questions, and then back to Congressman Caston to get some input on concrete next steps. What could that more modest than the BBB package look like? But first, Nina and Antonio, what if you have a question or something that you really feel comes forward, fire away.
I'm happy to jump in with a little bit of, just a little bit of the context of the political battle, because I agree with a lot of what both the congressman and Amy said. I mentioned the polls. If you look at Pew Research polls, 2/3 of Americans think the American government is not doing enough. Even 65% of Republicans believe that, or Republicans and those who lean Republican, believe that we should prioritize developing alternative energy sources over fossil fuels. Only 20% of Republicans and those who lean Republicans think fossil fuels are more important at this stage. So there's pretty strong, and you can go down the list of other ways that the majority of Republicans feel that climate change needs to be addressed and needs to be addressed urgently. Of course, the cynical side of me knows that a lot of Republican and Democrats, in the case of Joe Manchin, get tremendous amounts of money from the fossil fuel industry, so they may be disinclined to go against those funders. And I do see it, Andy, as you refer to, the comments that I get on different things online. You get a real strong divide between the extremes, who are the ones who usually vocalize on Facebook and on my bulletin pages, where the right is just slams the Biden administration for what they see as anti-fossil fuel policies, while the left goes after them violently as well. So you do get those extremes, and I wish we could appeal to this majority of Americans that agree. And on the other hand, I wouldn't let the Democrats off the hook, because Congressman, I look at what the House, your House Select Committee on the climate crisis, what they put out, and it's Putin's price hike, it's attacking the oil companies for high profits. It also gets kind of political, as opposed to looking in many cases for that kind of compromise. And I'll close this thing off with, I hope I don't embarrass Amy by quoting her, because she wrote a piece in the Washington Post that I thought, close to the end, ended very eloquently, where she calls on the oil industry and on political leaders to rise to the daunting challenges they've seen in the past. And here, I'll quote you directly, Amy. You said, both groups will diminish themselves if they spend today's crisis trading accusations about regulatory policy and shareholder dividends rather than acting in the national interest. And I do think that both sides are not, in many cases, acting in the national interest. They're playing politics.
Well, the congressman has to actually pop off momentarily, and I'd love to give you a minute to just sort of state your final manifesto here, Sean Casten.
Well,
thanks for being here.
Thank you, Andy. Look, the first thing I just want to respond to what Antonio said. If we can get very caught up in, the he said, she said, and everybody wants to have people yelling at each other on television. If the head of the Republican Party stood up and said gravity isn't real, I would ridicule him and humiliate him in public, not because I am partisan, but because that is how you kill people. When you have a party committed to the idea that climate change is not urgent, that we don't need to deal with this, that we're just going to plant trees, I cannot look my children in the eye if I treat that as a valid point of view. And that's not a partisan issue. That's because there are truths in this world. The challenge that I think is where I think where I'll acknowledge that both sides is that by and large, if you come into politics out of concern for the environment, you're probably a Democrat. If you come into politics out of concern for energy access, you're probably a Republican. And there's very little overlap in those worlds of trying to understand how do we make sure that your home is warm, that you meet your transportation needs, that you have a first world lifestyle, and you have a minimum environmental impact. And that and doesn't happen very often. And I think, part of the proof of that is we're concerned about energy prices right now. There's two ways to lower prices. You can boost supply or you can lower demand. To have a conversation in Washington about lowering demand, there's an awful lot of folks who say you're asking for hair shirts. There's so little understanding of the fact of how wasteful our energy system is, how much opportunity there is to make do with less. The fact that Switzerland generates 3 times as many dollars of economic activity for every BTU of energy they use. What are they doing right that we're doing wrong? The big thing is we subsidize the fossil fuel sector by $650 billion a year. It turns out that actually really gets in the way of efficient capital allocation. And you can see that tension playing out in the White House right now, where you have folks who are really strong and understand the demand side implications, the Jennifer Granholms, the Gina McCarthys, the John Kerrys, and the national security voices they're all Democrats, but they're all supply siders. Their voices are really ascendant right now. And I think the most important thing that we should be doing is saying, okay, how do we make sure that in the future we are not exposed to the volatility of some crazy petro dictator, whether that's Putin or Maduro or MBS? We don't want to be exposed to that. And there is the narrative that all we need to do is ramp up production in the United States is this fantasy that you can build an LNG terminal in 24 hours. To be fair, the narrative that we can cut our oil demand is a fantasy that we can build wind turbines and solar farms in 24 hours, right? And heat pumps and electric vehicle charging stations and all the rest of that stuff. And I would like to see the Biden administration use this as an opportunity to really be Churchillian and say, we've entered the area of consequences. The time for baffling half measures has come to a close, and I have nothing to promise you but fantastic wealth, because we're going to have so much money left in our pocket once we get on this. But that is only if we make the investments now to curtail demand, and to curtail demand in a way that maintains just as much access to hot water and cold beer. But those voices, I think there's just not a lot of people in Washington that I think have the understanding of both. And I appreciate being with you, because I can't say the same for this panel. You guys are terrific and delighted to be with you. And I'm sorry I can't stay for the whole thing, but always a pleasure to see you.
Well, I'm really appreciative if you could spend the time with us. And hopefully we talked to John Curtis's office about him coming on with you at some point soon. He's the Conservative Climate Caucus on your committee too. So let's hope we can resume the conversation. Good luck with the rest of your work.
Thank you all.
Thank you for doing this.
Thanks.
So there's plenty more here to talk about. Any reactions to that last
statement?
I
have a reaction. I think, and I'm coming from a very local perspective, reporting on low-income communities of color that are trying to build microgrids and community solar and do energy efficiency in a policy environment that is very hostile to those things and doesn't offer a lot of opportunity. And I think you mentioned with your heat pump kind of the wealth transfer. We've been talking since 2 years ago about this idea of reparations, and I feel that one of the areas that we can transfer wealth to our lower income communities is by helping them become more energy efficient and providing access to things like heat pumps and community solar. And some of those things are going to require not only, policy leadership at the national level, but also at the state and local level. And so that's sort of where we're coming from. I think that the sweet spot that the Senator mentioned between energy access and climate change really does lie in reducing demand where there's already a too high energy burden on electricity and natural gas customers. So I would just encourage everybody to kind of think about how that plays in, and it's very much at the local level, and it's a little bit separate from, but related to the oil conversation. But it's I think it's the path forward. I think it's the path that Biden's trying to take, at least in some of the efforts, like the Justice 40 initiative. And so, I don't know to what extent that's going to be successful, and I feel like we're already running out of time, perhaps, with his administration. I'm hoping I'm wrong, to get some of that stuff implemented. But, I do think that, now or in the future, that is going to be the path.
And how does that play to you, Amy, thinking about the policy?
I think Nina makes a really important point. The DOE had an announcement today about trying to channel some money to HBCUs. And, I engaged in a project I'm just finishing up now where we analyzed the 2009 stimulus to look at it, both geographically and through equity issues and inclusion. And it's shockingly bad. I mean, shockingly bad. Huge swatches of money went for utility scale solar in California, Nevada, and Arizona. Rest of the country, just a blank slate, no funding. Billions of dollars went to California. Very little money went to other parts of the country. I don't really count the nuclear assistance that went to Georgia. That was very high, but that's going in one small, a bucket. And then when you analyze both, which I've done, who got that money and what did they look like, in terms of, did they look like America? White men. No women-owned businesses. The Sabir program, which gives small grants to, startup companies and small companies with innovative climate solutions. No women, no people of color. And so I'm glad to see that DOE is trying to fix that now. But I think that that's part of what goes behind resistance to having big funding like the Build Back Better bill, because we saw a giant funding go into stimulus in 2009, 2010, and a lot of people in Silicon Valley became very wealthy. A lot of money was squandered in biofuels and produced no climate result, which people like me said, listen, biofuels are not going to get us where we need to be. We need to be talking about different kinds of alternative energy. And so I think there is this skepticism that we need to rise above and say, no, we have digital technologies, we have innovation today in these different buckets, whether it's deep offshore wind or whether it's community solar. There are things we can do that are cost effective today, and new kinds of technologies coming down the pike, whether that's, iron air batteries, which most of your listeners won't know what I mean, but it's a different kind of battery, which in some sort of unscientific way kind of works with the rusting process on the chemicals of a battery instead of, what we know about lithium ion. But my point to you is we need to be having those dollars, not only funding, someone in the garage that's a young white man, but training people in other kinds of schools in other parts of the country to participate in this new economy, so that we're not just favoring one kind of profile of a person, but this benefit that we're talking about goes across the entire spectrum. And one last point, since I know I'm waxing on too long, oftentimes groups invite me to come and speak to their convention. And I will tell you, I was invited to give a speech in Houston by what used to be the Association for Offshore Drilling Executives. And they are now the Association for Offshore Drilling and Wind.
Interesting.
Right? And that's in Houston. So, we know where we're going, and we know that people are pivoting from one sector to another. I know a lot of people in midstream natural gas are putting money down into hydrogen and putting money down into what we call renewable natural gas. So I'm making natural gas from waste or from landfill or from agricultural waste. So we know where we're going. But, we have to have the federal government rowing with us, and we have to have that rowboat picking up as many people as we can from different kinds of people that really is representative of our country.
Well, I agree with you and Nina on that it should be a broader based, effort. When you talk about federal government, it's what drives me crazy, because I just feel like so much of what they're doing is being done in a way that's not going to be effective. When you bury all these climate measures in Build Back Better, it just, you have something that the American people could probably get behind, but you're burying it in this massive omnibus bill that the American people aren't getting behind. And so it's again, the way politics works that drives me crazy. And it was one of the things where I feel that the congressman was a little disingenuous too, is when he was talking about, and I forgot to mention it when I was talking about what his committee puts out there. They're basically talking as if alternative forms of energy are going to bring down energy prices. They may at some point, but that's not the solution in the next year or the next couple of years. And so again, they keep playing these politics as opposed to focusing on what needs to be focused on. And to turn things on a more positive side, which is something you just raised a little bit, Amy. And Andy, something that I'm sure you've written about it at times as well. But looking forward, where are we getting? I mean, I see that, yes, solar is getting more efficient, that, yes, we're discarding the biofuel investment, although there were bad investments in solar during the stimulus project as well, that, of course, Republicans bring up to say, oh, look at all this wasteful government money. It's progress there. But when, I remember a luncheon, a Council on Foreign Relations luncheon a few years ago that I went to, and they had their energy guy speaking there, and he was talking about all these photovoltaic cells and how it will be going into paint someday. But this is years ago. Where are we on these technologies that will really?
We're almost there on the solar paint, Antonio. Yeah. That is still around the block, believe it or not. So just letting you know that could be coming.
But I guess that's my question: is how can we how far are we from the point where people won't be able to say, "Oh, renewables make no sense"? Where are we?
Listen, we're already there. Western Australia had brownouts all the time. They work with Tesla. They put batteries in. They did this small scale, virtual power plant thing I'm talking about, and it worked. And they don't have brownouts now. And they have a lot of deployed wind. And it was too costly to bring the natural gas around Western Australia, and they were exporting it from the East Coast. So, there are these things we can do. I mean, the president released the SPR, but I don't hear anybody talking about using telecommuting to relieve congestion in traffic, which wastes hundreds of thousands of barrels a day of oil every day. Like, all we need to do is say, I'm calling on, the chairman of companies around the United States to stagger work hours, which we can now do, right? And then in addition to that, let's in New York City, for example, Andy, you've been in this world with me. Why are we letting delivery vehicles block the roads at rush hour? I mean, we don't let you make a right turn. You can't go down certain 14th Street. Yeah. Like, why are we letting there be delivery vehicles, at from 8 to 9:30 or 7 to 9:30? Like, they're just things we could do that actually save fuel, that are really easy, that we just have to inconvenience ourselves a little bit. Same in Europe. But Antonio, to address your issue, for example, I understand the politics of saying that we subsidize the oil industry too much. But the reality is we have a tax break we give the oil industry to incent them to drill, but then we don't let them get that tax break if they put a data center to use the stranded natural gas. So they flare it into the sky, which causes much worse result for climate change. It'd be much better off to have that fuel a data center and then not need coal somewhere or some other kind of energy to do a data center. So that's just a little tweak to the tax code for a national emergency. We could even say for 6 months, to Ron Wyden's committee, but then it becomes very polemical. Oh, well, that would be a benefit to the oil industry. Well, you know what? We don't want them burning natural gas into the air and raising the price of natural gas. We want to use it. So if that means we have to give them a little tax adjustment, we should do it.
So there are a couple of points that have been made that I want to explore. One is, are we ever going to see, even with what's happening now in the world, the security issue alone, let alone climate concerns, who in the world in America could sell a constraint approach, a conservation approach? You know, Carter, we went through this with Carter and the sweater, and we got Reagan. And there were many things going on at the same time, but inflation was one of them too. So, I did a kind of visualization of this. I took a World War II poster where there was these posters during World War II to try to get people to drive less. And they had Hitler in your car. Like, you know,
yeah, brilliant.
So do you want Hitler riding along in your car, or do you want to do a car sharing thing? And would we do a Putin thing like that? Would we drive less for the sake of Europe's concerns about Vladimir Putin? I just don't know. I just don't think so. Well, Antonio, what do you?
Yeah, I'll address it because I got a poll for you, as I often do within much of my writing. And this might be my last point, Andy, because I've got to go to a faculty meeting at 2:00.
Yeah.
The CBS News and YouGov came out with a poll last year, and that is one of the issues. It's like, you see, as I was saying earlier, this broad-based support for, you know, clean energy, for addressing climate change in kind of these grand schemes. It's very much a not in my, you know, a NIMBY kind of situation, not in my own backyard. So when it involves higher taxes on corporations, when it involves the federal government doing things and all that, there's tremendous support out there for all these initiatives. But when we're talking now about whether you and I are going to make changes, then it's a different matter. And this is the CBS YouGov poll. And so they asked, to help stop climate change, would you take public transit? How many people do you think said would be willing to take public transit in order to improve things? Only 42% said. 58% said they would not. Pay more for utilities. Only 37% said they were willing to do it. 63% said they would not be willing to do it. Pay higher taxes. Only 35% said they would be willing to. Corporations, fine, but they won't. And of course, you know, that's kind of limited thinking, because if corporations paying higher taxes, you're probably going to end up paying higher fees for their products. But only 35% were willing to pay higher taxes, 65% no. And one final one was whether they would be willing to stop eating meat. And only 30% would be willing to stop eating meat, 70% would not. So clearly, not much support for really strong individual action to support some of these measures. And
that gets back to, and Nina, I'm sure you hear this too, Jesse Jenkins at Princeton, who's been digging in on these issues for a long time, recently said on Twitter and elsewhere, you know, until there's a seamless transition to these things being the norm, meaning, as was said earlier, an EV is just there, and there's a dealer or some web service that gets it to you at a price that's and performance that's like that of a car that came from Detroit, like the old Sienna we have down on the street here that I inherited from my dad when he passed away last year. You know, 23-year-old, 2000 Sienna, 100,000 miles. And I still find it very useful. And as soon as there's an EV version, I'll get to it. So this issue of inertia of when it comes down to personal action.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just don't put that much stock in these personal action surveys, because of course you don't want to inconvenience yourself, and of course, you know, things aren't going to change until they're easier. But you know, I do think that we just need to think of things more systemically and stop asking people what they're willing to do, because it's just going to be a losing battle. I mean, getting back to the Putin thing, I don't think we're there yet with Putin, and using that as a symbol to unite Americans. But you know, we may be heading in that direction. So you know, to me, maybe something like that, something that would be something that could unite Americans in this time is, maybe a negative, but maybe what's needed.
Antonio, you're heading off to a faculty meeting. Great to have you here. Let's try to do this again sometime on it. There are other issues.
I would love to. It's great to see you all, and enjoy the rest of the conversation.
And by the way, what do your students think of all this? Are your students in their little pockets, or are they thinking about consensus?
I can't say that I really asked them much about climate change, to tell you the truth.
I don't mean climate particularly. I mean polarization and
polarization. Yeah, it's certainly something that everybody's concerned about, and they're concerned about bias in the media. They're concerned, they see it happening, and definitely, they hope that that we can find more consensus. It seems like they are not as polarized at that age. There's much more consensus among them, and I think that's probably true if you look at, you look at generations. The different generations tend to agree more on certain things than others, and so I think the young kind of most of them are on the same page. You don't see very many conservative kids in my classes, but obviously that changes with time. But
great. Well, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Good to see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And for Nina and Amy, just a last word. If we did another one of these in 2 weeks, and I had that, let's say John Curtis, the House Conservative Climate Caucus guy. If you go to their website, it's we care about climate, period, but we also want more energy. And there's not a lot there. There's not an actual agenda. What's your last thinking on what's something concrete we could explore that might incrementally at least tip the system? Maybe Amy and then Nina.
I think we need to do two things at once. We do need to make sure we have programs in place that have the oil industry producing as much oil as possible as they can if we have to put sanctions on Russian oil and gas. We can produce an extra 1 million barrels a day here in the United States using the kind of systems we used in World War II, like government and federal intervention to do that. I laid out one idea in the Washington Post, but there are many different ways to do that. And that's the sort of here and now thing, right? And that really addresses Nina's issue too, because a lot of people are essential workers. They don't have access to public transportation in some cases, or the public transportation is a bus system that could go bankrupt if it's having to buy fuel. So, we need to let Biden address the here and now, because we're in the here and now. But that's no excuse to the Congress for not putting forward manufacturing plans and ways to make sure that we're manufacturing and processing critical metals that we're going to need for the energy transition. We're making sure that our setup is such that car companies understand. I mean, I personally like California's policy of setting a date for when I'm going to ban the manufacturing of combustion engine cars, because car companies change their platform only once a decade, because then they have to amortize the manufacturing equipment. So if I'm telling you in 2035 you're not selling an SUV that runs on gasoline, then you're going to make the investments now, so that when we get to 2035 you're producing electric. So or some other hydrogen or whatever. So I'm big on having policies that I got it. We are in a situation today, we have to address that situation, but that could be packaged in a bill that really locks down on these things we're going to need to have our economy be competitive 5 and 10 years down the road. And Germany reacted to Putin by announcing that instead of waiting until 2050, they're going to get to 100% renewables by 2035. That is the right policy for them. They will be able to do it. They have offshore wind. They can connect to European hydro, right? They can use imbalance markets and trade with the French, who have nuclear. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can be done if we're ambitious enough. And I hear it in the weeds, but to get to that hearing, what I'm hearing in the weeds of policies that the Biden administration is endorsing, that the oil industry is willing to do, that the Congress is saying, individual Congress people are saying, yes, I would vote for that. We need to change the rhetoric. We need to tone down this ridiculous rhetoric, and we need to talk straight to the American people. I went on National Journal, it's a call-in show, and it was rigorous because people called in with things that are completely inaccurate. I saw a congressman from Indiana on C-SPAN say that the president was wrong to release the Strategic Petroleum Reserve because it's a tool that is reserved for wartime. Like, excuse me?
Right.
Excuse me? Like, what reality are you in? I'm in the reality where I'm having to read the newspaper every day and worry about, Putin's nuclear submarines that are off the east coast of the United States. Right. And what reality are you in there in Indiana? Because you're inland and you just don't think that if a nuclear warhead is tactically used against the United States, it's going to be deployed in Indiana. So therefore, we shouldn't have released the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So that to me is like the reality, illustrating the reality that we're in, that I find sometimes when I'm doing public speaking now, Andy, I have to explain to people that what the war is really about, and that there is a war, and we're participating with arms shipments, and we're participating with economic sanctions, because people are not getting that. And then I was on a call-in show, Climate One, wonderful podcast.
Yep.
And they asked me, same thing, caller in, and they asked me point blank, what should people do if they want to help the Ukrainians? And you know what I said? Get out of your car.
There you go. That's a great place to cap today's show. And Nina, what are you writing about that's related to this, for the next hour? You probably you're on deadline, I'm sure.
I think I'll just really quickly say, you started the question saying, what can we do incrementally? I'm not sure there's anything we can do incrementally at this point. I agree we have to deal with the here and now, but to the extent that we can also, counter that or bargain with the 5-10 years from now, the better off we'll all be.
Well, thank you both for being here today, and also Sean Casten, representative from the 6th District in Illinois, and Antonio Mora, a view from the center, Nina Ignaczak from Planet Detroit and Michigan Climate News, and Amy Myers Jaffe. I'll have to get you on again. I really enjoy your perspective, and your frankness is refreshing, from Tufts University. Maybe we should just do a session on women and energy sometime. I really am interested.
I'd love to do that, Andy.
Let's
definitely plan that out. Great.
This is Andy Revkin at the Columbia Climate School and in Lenape Territory, north of New York City and Hudson Valley. This is the end of this episode of Sustain What. If you're out there, you can share this on all the different platforms you've been watching on, and send me notes. Look at that scrolling distracting bar at the bottom, ways to get in touch with me. And do follow Michigan Climate News, maybe perhaps if you're not there, because the issues there are everywhere: poverty, justice, climate, resilience, energy transformation. And be well, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.